First off, I just want to thank the whole Pit Agile crew for inviting me to come share this information. This has been percolating for the past 3 years, and I'll give the backstory on how this whole thing came together. Now, before we kick off, I'm not going to suggest in a group like this that you're going to hear anything totally new. You're going to hear stuff that you've heard before, you're very familiar with, maybe even find some of it heretical. Okay. But that's okay. My hope is that by framing some of this information in a slightly different way, that it at least gets us thinking creatively and maybe even coming back and saying, hey, this is just untenable. This would need to be changed here. And, that my biggest motivation here is that all of us as thinkers and practitioners continue to move the agile space forward. Okay. So a little bit about me. I started as a developer. I started super late. I didn't get my first computer until I was late into my 20s. Okay. But once I got it and got exposed to, I was always interested in analytical philosophy and logic, symbolic logic. And then when I finally realized that computers were just giant symbolic logic crunching machines, I was like, okay, I'm into this computer stuff. I did some scrappy startup type stuff when I started programming prototypes and whatnot. And that I found myself as an entrepreneur and having my first software company, Ghost Army Software, get purchased. Was doing like business automation and spent years doing a big integration type stuff on what does that look like, scaled out. And what that meant was really doing more of a team management than writing code. And so when I came out of that phase in my life and needed to enter back into the enterprise world, I thought, what best describes what I've been doing? And that's how I accidentally found myself in the Scrum Master Agile space. And so for the past 3 years, I've been at UPMC Enterprises, working real closely with Rick Pollock. And that's a big shout out I want to make. A lot of this has been basically two years of me and Rick, like working day in, day out, like very closely together, like riffing off of ideas and crystallizing this stuff. If you want to learn more about me, you can go to justiceconder.com. Okay, so I want to kick off this talk with a quote, because this quote, if you've seen any of my other stuff or talks or anything like that, this quote it is a foundational stone in like why I'm in this space and what gets me out of bed in the morning. This quote is from Mick Kirsten. He's famous for that book, Project to Product. And it is also used real high profile way in the SAFe Scaled Agile Framework system. And the quote is, it says, those who master large scale software delivery will define the economic landscape of the 21st century. And that really kind of puts goosebumps on my arms, because I've been exposed early in my programming career to the whole technological singularity. Software is eating the world. All companies are becoming software companies. And these are predictions that were made in 2011, like when cloud and stuff was just happening. And so over the past couple of years, I've been like trying to examine, okay, how do you master large scale software delivery? Okay. And where do you turn to when you're trying to answer this question? I'll tell you where I turned. I turned to charts like this. If I could see everyone's camera, I'd say, raise your hands if you've seen this type of thing. I had this thing hanging on my cube wall for years with the intention from a, foundational level that I was going to master every node in this thing. And I was going to become a kung fu ninja in this. Okay. Now, this is surely possibly, arguably overcomplicating the reality of it. Right. And the main players in this whole scaled, agile, large-scale software delivery are like SAFe, LESS, Nexus, Scrum at Scale, DAD, Discipline Agile Delivery. And I found myself in a position, I'm like, well, how does one evaluate these competing philosophies and approaches? And is it possible to come in and do some kind of analytical comparison and avoid flame whorls and accusations of quote unquote process religion? I don't know if anyone ever heard that term before, process religion. And the idea is you say, we do this thing this way and use these words because that's the system we follow, rather than this is the best way to do this and here's why, from like a scientific basis. Okay. Another thing that was happening right around the time I was saying, okay, how does one become a master of large scale software delivery, is that I was in a position where we were doing some hiring. And so we were, as at the same time that we're going through this this questioning and this deep dive study, we're interviewing a junior Scrum masters, agilists, people from these different scaling frameworks. And we're asking questions like, what makes a great team? I even think Rick, he came up with this question, like, what makes a great team? And we got a lot of great answers. Who's going to deny answers like this? They're not good. Embrace collaboration, common goals, aligned goals, patience, friendship, all this stuff. No, we don't like intensity. We don't like flexibility. It's all good stuff. But then if you change the question a little bit, you do run into a funny conundrum. What would someone say if we said, hey, what makes a great football team? And we listed all this type of stuff, teamwork, trust, all this, right? But they didn't win any games. I'm going to argue that the only way we know these other characteristics are important is because we find them in and among teams that win games. And so the question then is, what does it mean for a team to win games? Okay. What does it mean for a team? And I'm going to argue that, at least in this context, that great teams ship. Okay. So the question is then, is a great team delivers efficiently, predictably, and sustainably. All right. Now, I'm not making any statement about if they're predicting the right thing. That's outside of the scope here. I'm just talking about delivery. Okay. If the business or the customer wants a giant hot air balloon shaped like a duck, and no one wants to buy it and they want to spend the money, and the team does it efficiently, predictably, and sustainably, then the team's a success. So that's outside of the scope of what we're asking, like how, the execution side, the delivery. And so what we mean by that is like, it's efficient. The team knows what to do and they do it. It's smooth. It's predictable. The team knows how long it'll take, and it's sustainable, which means it's a business as usual type process. Teams require no heroics or hysterics. All right. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is lay out an A, part B, to say part A, I'm going to put forth a model, a foundational, minimalistic, and purposefully reductionistic model of bare minimum, avoiding terminology and all. And then we're going to say, what's the process? So here's the thing that happens. Here's the idea, the model we work around. Here's the process of like how this machine runs. What data is created from that? And then once we have that as a foundation, then we can say, okay, how do we apply this to our advantage and to the advantage of the teams? Now, I'll say this, there's a great flavor of, and then I have a great love for the axiomatic method. This is, you start with the simplest things imaginable and build up from them. And so there's a flavor of that in this. Euclid's elements, where what's a line? What's a point? Peano's postulates, like what are the 10 rules that define all arithmetic, right? Or Bertrand Russell's Principia, like how can you build all of mathematics down into a handful of rules? Okay, so first, the model. This is an irreducible, or my attempt at an irreducible model of iterative delivery. And like I said, some of this, folks in this room are going to be like, this is obvious, but follow with me and we'll get to the cool stuff a little later. Okay. All right. So first up, I'm going to argue that the iteration is the fundamental model here. Okay. And that is, it's just a loop. And just like in science, you do an experiment. This loop is the atomic piece of iterative delivery. Okay. It has a few elements here. There's the planning, like there's the start of it. What are we going to do? There is the review, like a demonstration of what we accomplished. That's the end. And then interspersed between the beginning and the end are checkpoints to say, hey, how are we converging on our goal? All right. And then underneath the iteration, you basically have retrospectives. There's a little bit of terminology there, but it's basically opportunities to go back and make modifications to whatever properties of that iteration. All right. So No religion here, just empiricism, and no mention of roles, meeting length, medium, none of that. All right. I would argue, and I don't think anyone would argue against me, that the reason why we're in this group is we believe that in a complex and changing system, the best way in order to produce an outcome is to do a short experiment where you try something, see the result, see how it lands, and do it again and again. And in fact, that's the very basis of all machine learning that's happening right now. Short guesses and then seeing what happens and do it again. It's like the analytical science, right? Okay, so that's the model. Here's the process. The process happens in 3 layers, and each layer is foundational to the next one. So that is, the first layer is continuous flow. The second layer is that iterations, and then the third is releases, right? So first up, continuous flow. We have something called a workflow, and this exists because we're making this big statement that all repeatable work happens through a process, and that process can be represented visually with a workflow. And these are the fundamental properties that have to be present. Now, one thing that's interesting about this approach is, even though in the context we're talking about like software and stuff, what's amazing about this is, as many of you surely already know, this can be abstracted and applied to any type of repeatable process, okay? The argument here is, if we start with the smallest units of delivery in our work items, we ensure that the larger units inherit any improvements obtained in predictability and sustainability. And so at this level, we measure how effectively individual work items can make their way through the process we call the flow. Now, to touch on the absolute minimum necessary properties are, we need an explicit definition of what a work item is. That's this work item here. This could be a mechanical device, legislation, educational curriculum, whatever. 2, an explicit entry and exit point of the workflow, right? It's started, now it's completed. And then there could be any number of intermediate steps, and it'll be really invaluable. It's not necessary, but it'd be invaluable to distinguish these workflow steps between active and inactive workflow states, creating what you guys are familiar with, like a pull system where, hey, workflow state is done here. Now it's waiting for the next, and the next pulls it in if they have capacity. When they're done, it's waiting in the next. Okay. So we know like how long is work just sitting. Okay. So this is a foundation of everything going forward, the flow. Next up, we have the iteration. And the idea here is each new iteration should produce a new potentially shippable product increment. Okay. Now it's the increment really is a truce between continuous change and platonic perfection. It's somewhere in between. No statement on how long it should be, just that after this runs, we have another experiment, another version of the product, the value, the thing that we're accruing value to. Yeah. So we have the flow, we have the iteration, and next up we have a release. And a release I'm defining as a thematic collection of the work of one or more iterations. Now, you could ask at this point, why do we even need a release if we're producing value with every increment? And the idea here is that it's almost always the case that the thematic collection of value that goes out from organizations and entities takes an accumulation of increments for it to go out. It may be there in the product in some like below the surface type way, but the idea is like the organization or some larger organizational entity wants to release these in combination with marketing or fanfare or some thematic announcement. All right. Yeah. So here's the thing. If the previous 2 levels are sound, then this release thing will be business as usual. It will happen almost without effort. And it's the thing that people most are concerned about. When are we going to ship? Are we on track, off track? Now, to tie these things together, I think this imagery is very fitting. This is a Sozu or a Shiadoshi, and it basically means, as I understand it, is a device for scaring deer. And the idea is when you have a garden and deer are coming to eat your garden, you want something that kind of startles the animals. And so that's where this Japanese water fountain came about. And you can see it consists of a bamboo tube and pivoted on one side. Now, how this imagery connects is the rate at which the bamboo tube drops is 100% determined by the flow. If the flow changes at all, 100% it will change the rate of that bamboo drop. Okay. And here's the second piece is the actual bucket. If you imagine that larger container below is a bucket with a big handle on it, it represents the release, right? So you have an accumulation of those improvements, and then you have the gardener's preference, arbitrary desire at any point, they can go over and pick up that lower bucket and then go and water the garden. They could do it after the bamboo shoot drops once, or they could do it after it drops 5, 6, 7, 10 times. All right. But oftentimes in quote unquote agile circles, there is a complete focus on just the drop, just the iteration, when it's totally determined by the flow. And then that imagery is fully closed there with the bucket underneath the release. Seen in this kind of nested way, we do get a bigger picture. And it feels like it does take us away from just a process religion of, oh, the book says this, we should do that. And it's what we really have here is cycles within cycles. You remember from our iteration bare metal model, we have days, and then we have continuous flow. Okay. And then we have the iteration and then all the way up to the release. And this kind of cycles within cycles is like what we typically see in things in nature. Okay. Now, obviously many people recognize some of the comparisons I'm making here are what are made between Scrum and Kanban. And up until this point, it's been almost the universal posture that these are competing approaches to looking at delivery. And I would strongly argue that it's an absolute false dichotomy, and that without flow, there can be no predictable cadence. And to put these in the most stark contrast with each other, we'll step in and use some terminology here, is with Kanban, we have flow without cadence. It has a rigorous methods of viewing, measuring, improving the flow of work, but lacks regular introspection events and a higher level notion of batch size. Whereas with Scrum, we have cadence without flow. We have clearly defined introspection events and the notion of a product increment, but no intra-sprint strategy for delivering that increment. And I actually think before COVID hit, we were starting to see the winds of change effect, in that an addition was made, a book alongside the main Scrum guide was put out called Kanban for Scrum Teams. And that book, put out by the same organization, it didn't put it out as here's a competing way. It said here's how Scrum teams should and could implement this. And I would highly encourage everyone to read that. And that's a model in the process. Are there any questions before we hop into the data produced by this? Okay. Yep. One drive to why is he avoiding terminology? We don't know what this is terminology and systems and frameworks they have produced, and they're unavoidable, but there exists incredible prejudice about many of these things. And I found that coming into a new environment and not using those terms, but employing the same concepts and approach can almost be more effective. All right. It keeps us from being shoehorned into a purely software thinking and remove some of that prejudice. So we looked at the model, we looked at the product process. So what data is produced by this description? Now, we could just dazzle you guys with 30 charts and all this and that and this and that. The point is, let's start with the bare minimum. Now, on the flow level, the first piece of data that is produced is a cycle time. And a cycle time is how long does it take an issue, individual work item issue, to be completed, right? Now think about it. If we start at this level, if we can constrain and control the atoms, right, or limit their variability, then you can control molecules. And if you control molecules, then you can build it out of any material. Right. And so you can see this would be like what you typically see in a cycle time scatter plot, where the more spread out these items are, so the higher they go, then there's a greater variability on when they'll be complete. And if you can have a more constrained variability, then automatically right out the gate, you can say, we know how much we know, we can predict with statistical methods how long this work will be done. All right. Now, specifically, what this refers to is something called an SLE, or service level expectation. And what that is, a percentage and then how many days. 95% of our items get done in 17 days or less. Right. Now, let me tell you, let's say your sprint is 10 days, or your iteration's 10 days, and your SLE is 20 days. I don't need to see a single iteration to tell you the goals are not being met. It's impossible. And no matter how much kind of focus and additional work or whatnot, that won't be maintainable. But if you focus on individual work items as they come through and say, listen, let's ensure that these stay below this number, then the iteration goals will almost make themselves, right? So how do you do that? This is a lagging indicator. This is a goal. What do we do in order to meet that goal? Okay. Next up, we have this is the second data point. This is aging work in progress. This is all work that has been started. It is not done, and how much in danger any individual item is to exceeding the target cycle time. So what's good about this is a leading, not lagging indicator. The team can look at this, anyone can look at this and say, what should the team most focus on moving right now? You can see the oldest item right now is in that testing state. Without this piece of information, you won't know. It could be the thing that's in progress right now is the oldest and everything else is in a safe position. Now, what's good about this is that these different bands, green, yellow, orange, red, they'll be determined by whatever your history is. If your history is 95% of the time you get stuff done in 4 days or less, and something's at the 5-day mark, it's going to be in the red. As you improve, this gets tighter and tighter. So this data is generated by thinking in terms of this workflow. The next thing, pretty straightforward, is the iteration. What are the analytics generated by the iteration? Now, surely there's a lot of stuff we could look at, but I'm going to say the simplest thing we could look at is what's the burn down? This is the work we're attempting to complete by the end of the iteration. How are we converging on delivering it? Now, one thing I want to point out, which I struggled with and was tricky for a long time, I just couldn't wrap my head around. I said, how come my burn down charts never look like they're supposed to? What I found is that other tools in the wild that we often use, think about this. In a hose where water's passing through it, at any segment of that hose, as water leaves that segment and moves to the next segment, does the previous segment suddenly become empty in a continuous flow scenario? No. As it moves, new water will move into that space. And so if you have a burn down chart that is looking at all work being complete for the iteration and also tracking work that's picked up that's not a part of the iteration, like some tools do, Jira off, right? You will always have it with a perfect flow scenario. You will have the iteration goal is completed and then new work is added. And in 2 weeks or however long your iteration is, you will basically have just as much in flight as you did exactly 2 weeks prior. Now, there may be different ways of working to avoid this. I would argue that if you're counting all in-flight work in this way, that this is optimally what you want to see as you see a snapshot. Back to the original point, I'm just going to say the piece of data produced here is the iteration burn down. Next up, very simple, straightforward. We have the release. Remember, we had those 3 layers. This is the level of the release. And we're just going to say when the org has a goal on when this thing wants to go out with all the fanfare, and this is the burn down on that. Now, the funny part is this is the question that everyone wants answered. When will it be done? When will it be done? I've been in situations where the org doesn't even care about the sprints. All they want to know is, are we on track, off track for the release? But the funny part is that is 100% determined by the flow and sprint over sprint delivery. Okay. And if value is being delivered with every iteration, then this release, there's a tremendous flexibility in here. Maybe the org decides to go out early without the little extra bell and whistle at the end. Or maybe at some point they say, we want to wrap our marketing around that extra thing and we have to wait another iteration to get that. All of a sudden, this becomes a more fluid, marketable thing. Now, what I just touched on, that's the foundation. That's the model, the process, and the data produced. Obviously, extremely reductionistic, but at this point, I think we'll get into the interesting stuff on how does one use this now to the benefit of the teams. Are there any questions from anyone? Okay, cool. First up, data-driven influence. Another question that we asked these potential Scrum applicants was, how do they get teams to do something? They want them to try something or whatever. And what was frustrating is, as a Scrum Master, Agilist, you frequently find yourself in a position where you are responsible to be a change agent, but you really don't have authority to make changes. That has to be gained via persuasive influence, social capital, reputation. That's where that has to come. What's difficult about this is that it seemed like all the applicants we asked, and my own personal studies or experience has been, I found myself frequently feeling like a pretty pathetic salesperson. Where imagine a salesperson comes to your office and says, hey, do you want to buy this roof insurance? And you're like, no. And they're like, okay. And they come back the next day. Do you want to buy the roof insurance? No. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to sit in the waiting room on the couch till you feel bad for me and you buy this insurance. I'm like, there's got to be a better way here. All right. And so that's where we're going to introduce this next idea of like specifically and explicitly using this data to create feedback loops using just human psychology. So the premise is this: provide people with information about their actions in real time, then give them a chance to change those actions, pushing them towards whatever your predetermined behavior you're trying to get. So the cool part is if you say, listen, this is the basis on which we deliver. These are the metrics that are produced. And then showing this information to produce those changes. Now, the interesting part on a human psychology and even a physiological basis is that the human body moves to where the gaze is on. You ever found yourself driving on the road and something catches your eye on the side of the road on either side, and you're looking, and next thing, with even you trying not to, your hands begin to turn in the direction of that thing. All right. Marketers use this special software to determine interest via eye dilation, pupil dilation. Okay. The connection between our behavior and our eyeballs is called the eye, the opening to the mind, the brain. All right. So we're going to use this data for feedback loops. Now, the way we're going to do this is through 4 steps. We're going to, 1, restrict focus. This is about measuring the efficiency and predictability of the delivery process. 2, establish baselines. Progress, not perfection. Great teams can do even better. Okay. 3, review regularly. Objects become invisible with familiarity. You ever had the stack of books on the kitchen table and it's just there for so long that eventually you're completely blind to it until you have guests over and you go to clean up and you're like, man, I've been leaving this junk on the table for 2 years. Okay. So just having these up on a wall is not enough. You want regular review. And then the 4th here is the publicize. Human psychology comes to weigh in for things like personal excellence, reputation, healthy competition, even gamification play into this. So those first 2, we have the restrict focus, establish baselines. Let's look real quick at this: review regularly and publicize. And the interesting part is when we look at our fundamental model here, we have specific events here that are perfectly designed to review these specific data points. at the beginning of the iteration, the team knows what its cycle time is. They know where they're currently at. 2 is, as the iteration moves on, they know, based upon the work item age, what items are in danger of exceeding those targets or where the team can swarm to address that. And then at the end of the iteration, the team knows, did we deliver what we said we're going to? And then how does this play into our overall release burn down? Okay. And so by introducing these data points at these specific points, like this is a part of the review, one is you're not coming in and saying, this is what we're going to do. You're a free agent, part of the team, just like any other engineer in the PO. You can simply use this time to show this information. At stand-up every day, people say, hey, we do something in my teams right now. We work the board. We open up all in-flight stuff in our workflow. We move from right to left, touch on each one. We focus on the work, not the people. And then the agilist can say, okay, let's look at what I call the hot ones. Bring up this work item age and say, oh, where are we at? All right. So that's a regular review at these key points. Now, and this is something that comes up very strongly of the marriage between the Scrum Guide and the Kanban for Scrum teams. It says, use these data points in these pre-existing events already. Okay. Next up is this publicize. One, you're regularly reviewing within the team. The next up is publicize. Now, we know this term from the literature, information radiators, and I wonder if familiarity has made us like become blind to it or whatever. But having this stuff is impactful because all of this information can be in real time, and not just that the entire team can see it, but all the teams, the entire org. This could be, and these are in concrete data points that are shared across every delivery team. You can have leaderboards, you can have all this, okay? And so this is where suddenly the data influences behavior, and you get to decide what data is presented and create this feedback loop, and definitely have it in the hands of the team. The teams say, we think this data point, there's a nuance here. We're like, okay, let's change it. We'll change it across the whole org. So that's the data-driven influence piece. Okay. And so next up, we have this data-driven adaptation. All right. Now, no feedback loop is complete, like just looking at data and then trying to make changes outside of that system doesn't itself create a feedback loop. All right. Here's a diagram of a feedback loop. So the idea is we're talking about dashboards, and data is generated and displayed and used to influence teams. But we want to have the response as a part of the system itself. I use the analogy of a car. The driver is seeing things on the dashboard, seeing things out the window, and okay, now they're shifting gears, they're turning the steering wheel, they're hitting pedals and all this, right? And so how do we capture this and make a closed circuit and keep it a part of our system? And the idea there is the very actions taken by the team come right back into the feedback loop. For some of where I'm at right now, for some of the teams, what we'll do is we do have actions that are taken at the conclusion of an iteration, and those actions themselves are unique issue types that make their way through the workflow. These could be changes in working agreements, additional training activities, changes in workflow states, WIP limits. And so basically what we have is we have an organizational playbook of levers. Hey, this is a known thing. Let's change the WIP limit. We've seen this pattern elsewhere. Let's add some training here and there. And again, in our reductionistic system, we do have an event that's specifically designed to create these type of work issues, the retro. And so retro actions as inputs to the system. Okay. Any questions, comments thus far? Okay, cool. Now, one thing I will mention is I found myself frustrated in the past where I found the retrospectives to be about like, how do you feel? How do I feel? As soon as these data points are the starting point of the conversation, suddenly I'm calling it retrospectives become very rich. It's less about how we feel than about what happened, what behavior do we change to change that in the future. I'm calling it more meat on the bone. There's something better to have people riled up about some data in a meeting than everyone falling asleep, taking a nap and being like, it was a good one. Yeah, cool. Good story. Thumbs up. There introduces some objectivity here, and people start to, I call it like play baseball. You don't even need to drive this. It begins to gamify itself. Okay. If we take this approach and say, listen, we're going to define fundamental delivery metrics, a fundamental delivery process, publicize, review those, compare them, and then when we're not landing where we want, make changes and have those changes go through a system, we end up with something that feels very different than the newest flavor of XYZ vanilla chocolate new scaling framework. Okay. Not only does it feel different, but it does enable a different level of scale. So I'm calling this a data enabled scale. This is the tool of large scale, not just software delivery, but large scale delivery. All right. Now, often what it sounds like to me is that existing scaling approaches, they sound sometimes like just adding longer meetings, more frequent meetings, more specialized roles, increased hierarchy is probably the biggest one. And maybe this hierarchy has names that sound like there should be a part of an agile system, but I find sometimes I feel like they violate the fundamental tenets of this iterative delivery. Okay. Or if we say, we'll bring all the pieces together once a quarter. Well, at the lower level, we were saying we're going to produce something of value at every increment. And so I'm going to use an analogy here is at some point, adding more shovels doesn't do it. At some point, even the best efforts of doing all of this just won't move the mountain. We need an order of magnitude, something different. And that's where we see this giant earth mover. All right. Now I'm going to make a statement here and say some scaling is only possible with certain technical and tooling prerequisites. Now we tend to think, hey, we're humans. There's a human element. And absolutely, I'm not denying that at all. But I'll use an analogy. So here's the analogy. And this is what I mean by order of magnitude solutions or changes. Imagine you had 7 software teams and no teams were using source control. They were using email. They were using Slack, pagers. They had a bunch of meetings. They had new roles. They were using a scaling framework. Could it possibly work? I'm going to put $1 million on that it's impossible. Now, right there is an analogy or an example that should be a warning to us that putting some more soft fixtures around a thing may still be totally insufficient. Okay. So that's a source control analogy. And I'll throw this other analogy out there, and it's less of an analogy. This actually happened, but if anyone is familiar with the Jeff Bezos API mandate, the Bezos API mandate is the most technical but secret thing that happened. The gigabrains attribute possibly the entire success of AWS on this foundational decision that was made by Jeff Bezos. And it almost sounds extreme. To this day, this was made many years ago, but to this day, when you hear it, you're like, it's a little extreme. Okay. And the mandate was this: an email went out from Jeff Bezos to the entire organization. And he said, there will be no meetings to coordinate between teams. None. All interfacing has to happen through public facing APIs. So if one team on AWS has something that they're releasing or some update, they cannot meet with another team to coordinate. Say, when are you going out? When will go out? Basically, every team had to interface with each other's team software through public-facing API, and updates had to happen through those APIs being updated, documentation being made. Now, what he did is he made a programmatic pipeline now between all those teams. And his statement was so strong that at the end of this single email, when it said, this is like one paragraph, he says, anyone caught not following this mandate will be fired instantly. That's how strong this was. Okay. And so when we look at that and we think about the analogy of the source control, we should pause and say, okay, is adding more of these soft fixtures and roles and then more coordination the solution? And I'm arguing pretty much in this talk that this data-driven agility should be the fabric on which other things are built. Now, those metrics may be slightly different. Maybe they're measured different. Maybe there's additional, but the approach itself should be the foundation on which we build these other things to know, oh, these other things actually help or hurt the team, because we know how well the team is delivering. Now, another thing that is unlocked by this approach is something I'm calling command center navigation. Now, the idea here is that you want an organizational network at a glance, all right? And I'm going to argue far out there that this is consistent with several trends. The trends in the modern world of concentration of proficiency. And the idea here is that more and more powerful tools will be in the hands of people who know how to use them, and they will take increasing amounts of the entire economy. All right. And whereas before you needed 7 cashiers, now you have 10 self-checkouts and a single cashier overseeing the process to remove any blockers. You see, it's a kind of a practical example of that, but that's happening. Cal Newport talks about this in his deep work, where he said your ability to concentrate deeply on problems, he's like, that is the power unlock there. It's consistent with another trend is organization as code. The whole DevOps movement was, let's define our operations as code itself. So rather than going in and clicking buttons, configuring, we'll have text files that actually says what our entire infrastructure is. And so we've married these two worlds. Like, you are a developer of our infrastructure. Other trends, remote, async, self-service. And so the basic idea here is that rather than having a dedicated person for every team saying, hey, I'm here, I'm doing this, doing that, you can have people who are skilled at analytics and about data-driven agility sitting in front of a screen and seeing basically all the data produced across many teams. And they're able to see, hey, there's a problem here, and go in and go to where they're needed, go to the points of highest return. All right. So that's this idea of command center navigation, where the idea is you're managing a network of things. Next up, one of the last things I want to look at here is the evolution of a role. According to the textbook, the idea of a Scrum Master is that there's one for every team. The funny part is I really frequently ask myself, is anyone doing this? More frequently, what you have is you have teams where one person on that team picks up that role, or the whole team share it, or we have the agile coach who moves from organization to organization to come in and set things up. Now, it may be that this is just a question of proficiency, right? And the Scrum Master is here to stay. But I honestly find myself very hard to find companies and organizations that are following this. This is a Scrum Master. They're on a team and they're on here forever. And we may see increasing moves away from this. Now, myself and Rick have more so adopted purposefully a general term of agilist. Okay. We feel it more captures what we're trying to do. All right. And this is also a push against the idea of someone in our role and someone with our job being a meeting facilitator or an impediment gopher. Right. And the idea is what we're trying to do is engineer a process and design a system for efficiency and throughput. It's an organizational architect type thing, because the real goals are organizational design and creating the system, efficient onboarding, and then creating these real-time feedback loops, self-directed teams. The crazy part is the entire goal is to have teams that don't need you anymore. All right. And that frees you up to say, I can go as needed, go to other areas of the organization. And even the Scrum Guide itself real explicitly calls out that you're a change agent for the org. It's a big picture type stuff. So that's I think, a change that we see when we say, okay, if this is all data, this is dashboard, command center navigation, to move to more mindset of a program agilist rather than a Scrum Master on a single team. Okay, and this is where I really want to talk about how this fits with another kind of trend and a difference in thinking here is the data-driven unlock. All right, now this may be a little bit further out there, but just want to bring attention to the idea of the distinction between scaling up and scaling out. All right, scaling up is the idea that, hey, our one machine can't do it anymore. Our gaming box, it's just the games require too much graphics. We'll get a bigger one. The games get more sophisticated. We'll get a bigger one. That's scaling up. The idea with scaling out is rather than adding bigger and bigger, you can add another of the same size and get the same scale. It seems to me that most of the agile scaling frameworks are attempting to scale up rather than to scale out. And I'm going to say that I think the goal should be to eliminate coordination, not manage it. All right. And to actually increase silos strategically and reduce cognitive load in the process. And this may sound strange and kind of out there, but there's continuity with the other technical trends that we see. Microservices, that's a thing. All right. It's not even new. Micro front ends. Micro front ends are similar as microservices, but if you recall, like microservices, you get a resilience by having many back-end data sources coming into a single application. Micro front ends is the idea that even the individual pieces of that front end are come in from different teams and are constructed on the fly at runtime. And the idea here is that between microservices and micro front ends, you can have a single application and each individual subcomponent of the application can be driven by an autonomous team. It all gets stitched together at runtime. The next trend is serverless, also known as function as a service. And the idea here is rather than a single DevOps kind of team having to manage and do all this stuff, they just provide a fabric, a serverless execution runtime, and each team could use what they want, deploy what they want. And so if you have data-driven agility in place, then it's not a nanny state overlooking of the teams. Basically, it encourages and increases autonomy because as long as the teams are continuing to operate and the dashboard's looking good, you produce this kind of self-service, autonomous lack of need for coordinating and syncing, this endless hell cascade of sync meetings, right? And then mentioned the Jeff Bezos API mandate. The idea that the teams can really work in autonomy and interface programmatically over an API. And all of this kind of works together to, I'm not going to say replace the agile landscape. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is we should have some data empirical base for what's efficient delivery, what's predictable, and some basic numbers to measure that. And then on top of that, we can introduce these other elements. And then anybody who shows up with a new flavor of XYZ, they don't get away with just selling this new flavor because it sounds good. Its impact on team delivery will be known and visible. No team can ever have any accusations to say, we're just doing this because somebody said it was the right way. Basically, it was like, we come back to show me the data, like Jerry Maguire style, show me the money. Show me the data, right? And my boss right now, used to be my boss, a little change in the org structure there, but Brian Sesko, every time I'd be like, I think he's show me the numbers, show me the numbers. And I appreciate that. And so I put in here a little XKCD comic because it's quite funny. The situation, there's 4 competing standards. And they say, hey, I know we should do one to rule them all. And then the new situation. there's 15 competing standards. Okay. So rather than any type of competitive anything, it's just let's start here and then build out. So I hope that this did spark some creative thinking or how we approach this stuff. It's nothing ground shaking, but it does imbue me with some creative juice to say we can take this further than it's going, or have some basis to say we are improving or we're not. Right. A lot of this was taken. This is I don't know if you call it a book. It's a pamphlet, 50-page book, small book, Data-Driven Agility. It's on Amazon. This was just my attempt to capture these thoughts. And there's several things in here too that, strangely enough, a lot goes into 50 pages. That's actually hard to put into 50 slides. So some stuff in here about story points. What are they? What are they? Also, yeah, some other things we don't have time to get into if anyone would like to check that out. Next up, a little plug. I don't reckon myself. We've tried to document some of the ideas here in different ways. One way is through the dragonagility.com. Our attempt to say, hey, how could this be structured in such a way to say, could we come in and show this stuff, do a data baseline with these tools, and then let companies run rather than what happens in other places. The agile coach comes in, is supposed to be here for 3 months, and now he's here 3 years or forever.